Welcome to medieval Europe, where bread wasn't just sustenance, it was a potential gateway to madness. Picture this: you're a peasant woman in 13th century France, grinding your daily rye into flour, when suddenly your fingers start tingling. By evening, you're writhing in agony, hallucinating demons crawling across your bedroom walls, and by morning, you're dancing uncontrollably in the village square alongside dozens of other women who can't seem to stop moving. Your neighbors whisper of witchcraft, the priests speak of divine punishment, but the truth is far stranger than either could imagine. This is the story of ergot, a fungus so powerful it would later give birth to LSD, so devastating it killed tens of thousands, and so mysterious that medieval Europe blamed everything from Satan to sorcery for its effects. If you enjoy drifting off to tales of history's most bizarre medical mysteries, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that blur the line between science and supernatural terror. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's something oddly fascinating about sharing these dark medieval secrets across centuries and continents. Now settle in as we explore how a simple loaf of bread became medieval Europe's most unpredictable drug dealer. You wake up to screaming. Not the usual medieval screaming, mind you. This isn't someone giving birth in the next hovel over, or a neighbor getting their tooth pulled with rusty pliers. This is different. This is Margot from down the lane, and she's been shrieking for 3 days straight about invisible flames consuming her hands. You stumble outside in your rough woolen shift, bare feet hitting the cold dirt, and what you see defies explanation. Margot is there, yes, but she's not alone. 7 other women from your village are gathered in the square, all of them moving in ways that make your stomach lurch. They're dancing, but calling it dancing feels wrong. It's more like they're being puppeteered by something unseen, their limbs jerking and twisting in rhythm with music only they can hear. Agnes, the baker's wife, spins in circles until she collapses, then immediately springs back up to continue her grotesque waltz. Old Beatrice shuffles and hops with the desperate energy of someone half her age, her grey hair whipping around her face as she mutters prayers and curses in equal measure. And there's young Isabel, barely 15, her eyes rolled back so far you can see only the whites, her mouth stretched in a grin that belongs on a death mask. You want to help them. You want to shake them, splash them with cold water, anything to break whatever spell has seized their bodies. But something stops you. Maybe it's the way Margot turns toward you, her gaze focused on something just behind your left shoulder, her voice dropping to a whisper as she describes the demons only she can see. Maybe it's how Agnes laughs, a sound like breaking glass that makes your teeth ache. Or maybe it's because you've been feeling strange yourself lately. Just little things. A tingling in your fingertips when you knead the morning bread. A burning sensation that starts in your toes and creeps up your legs like invisible fire. Dreams so vivid they feel more real than waking life. Filled with creatures that shouldn't exist and colours that have no names. The priest arrives, his black robes billowing as he pushes through the growing crowd. Father Benedict has seen many things in his 40 years of shepherding souls, but even he stops short when confronted with this scene. The dancing women pay him no attention. They're lost in their own private hell, their bodies moving to rhythms that seem to come from deep within the earth itself. Demonic possession, he announces, his voice carrying the authority of someone who needs to sound certain even when he isn't. These women have allowed Satan into their hearts. We must pray for their souls and guard our own against similar corruption. But you're not thinking about Satan, you're thinking about the bread. Because here's what nobody in your medieval village understands yet. What won't be discovered for another several centuries. The rye you've all been eating. The grain that forms the backbone of every meal, every loaf, every sustaining bite that keeps your family alive, has been invaded by something far more dangerous than any demon the church could conjure. Hidden within those purple-black kernels that look just slightly wrong, just slightly too large and discolored to be normal grain, lives a fungus called Claviceps purpurea. You don't know its scientific name, of course. You don't even know what a fungus is. But you're about to become intimately acquainted with its effects. This particular fungus has a talent for survival that would impress any medieval strategist. When it infects a grain of rye, it doesn't just kill the grain. Instead, it replaces the grain's contents with its own toxic payload, creating what looks like an oversized, darkened kernel that millers often mistake for particularly robust grain. These infected kernels, called sclerotia, are packed with a cocktail of alkaloids so potent that eating just a small amount can send a person into convulsions, hallucinations, or that peculiar state of manic dancing that's currently consuming your village square. The primary culprit in this chemical chaos is ergotamine, a compound so structurally similar to lysergic acid that future chemists will use it as the foundation for creating LSD. But ergotamine doesn't need a laboratory to work its magic. It's been perfecting its psychoactive recipe for millennia, creating a natural drug so powerful that it can turn an entire village into what appears to be a gathering of lunatics. What makes this fungal invasion particularly insidious is how perfectly it mimics safety. The infected rye looks almost normal. It grinds into flour that seems perfectly edible. It bakes into bread that smells like every other loaf you've ever made. There's no warning, no obvious sign that you're about to consume a hallucinogenic compound that will send your nervous system into complete rebellion. And the effects? They're as varied as they are terrifying. Some people, like Margot, experience what feels like fire consuming their extremities. The ergot alkaloids constrict blood vessels so severely that fingers and toes begin to feel like they're burning from the inside out. In severe cases, the blood flow becomes so restricted that gangrene sets in, and limbs literally begin to rot and fall off while the person is still alive. Others, like the dancing women in your square, find their nervous systems hijacked in different ways. The same compounds that cause burning sensations in some people trigger uncontrollable muscle spasms in others. These spasms can last for hours, even days, creating the appearance of frenzied dancing, when what's really happening is a complete loss of motor control. But perhaps the most disturbing effect of all is what's happening inside their minds. Ergot alkaloids are powerful hallucinogens, capable of producing visions so vivid and terrifying that they make waking life seem like a pale shadow in comparison. The demons Margot describes aren't metaphorical. To her altered brain chemistry, they're as real as the stone church tower, as solid as the muddy ground beneath her feet. Agnes isn't laughing because she's happy. She's laughing because her brain is being flooded with chemicals that are causing her to perceive reality through a lens of absolute chaos. The colors she sees are more saturated than anything that should exist. The sounds around her are twisted into symphonies of meaning that only she can interpret. Her sense of time and space has been completely shattered, leaving her trapped in a present moment that stretches into infinity, while simultaneously feeling like it's collapsing in on itself. And young Isabel? Her rolled-back eyes aren't a sign of spiritual ecstasy or demonic possession. They're the result of a nervous system under chemical assault, struggling to process sensory input that has been twisted beyond recognition by compounds that are rewriting the rules of perception with every heartbeat. You watch all of this unfold with growing dread, not just because of what you're witnessing, but because of what you're beginning to suspect about yourself. Those tingling sensations in your hands aren't just fatigue from kneading bread. That burning in your feet isn't just the result of long days spent working in the fields. And those vivid dreams that have been haunting your sleep for weeks, they might not be dreams at all. The crowd in the square continues to grow as word spreads through the village. People emerge from their homes like moths drawn to flame, unable to look away from the spectacle of their neighbors transformed into something unrecognizable. Some cross themselves and mutter prayers. Others whisper theories about curses and witchcraft. A few of the braver souls attempt to restrain the dancers, only to discover that the women possess strength that seems to come from somewhere beyond their physical bodies. Father Benedict calls for holy water and begins an impromptu exorcism, his Latin phrases cutting through the air like sword strikes. But his words have no effect on the dancing women. They continue their grotesque ballet, seemingly oblivious to his presence, to the crowd, to everything, except the internal rhythm that drives their movements. What none of you understand yet is that this isn't an isolated incident. Across medieval Europe, similar scenes are playing out in village after village, town after town. The fungus doesn't respect borders or social hierarchies. It infects the rye crops of peasants and nobles alike, though it's the poor who suffer most severely because they depend more heavily on grain as their primary food source. In some places, the outbreaks are even more dramatic than what you're witnessing. There are reports from France of entire towns consumed by dancing mania, with hundreds of people unable to stop moving for weeks at a time. In Germany, witnesses describe nuns who begin meowing like cats, their collective caterwauling echoing through monastery walls for hours each day until soldiers are called in to restore order through the simple expedient of threatened violence. The symptoms vary, but the cause remains the same: contaminated grain, processed into flour, baked into bread, consumed by people who have no other choice if they want to survive another day. The fungus spreads through communities like a slow-motion plague, striking seemingly at random, turning neighbors into strangers and transforming the simple act of eating into a game of chemical Russian roulette. Medical understanding of the time is utterly inadequate to explain what's happening. The four humours, bloodletting, prayer, and herbal remedies. These are the tools available to medieval healers, and none of them are equipped to address a problem that won't be properly understood for several more centuries. So the theories multiply like the fungus itself: divine punishment for collective sin, demonic possession targeting the weak-willed, witchcraft spreading like contagion from woman to woman, corrupted air carrying invisible poisons. The explanations are as creative as they are wrong, but they serve a psychological purpose. They give people something to blame, some way to make sense of the senseless. As you stand in that village square, watching your neighbors lose their minds in real time, you don't know that you're witnessing one of history's most widespread drug epidemics. You don't know that the bread you ate this morning contained compounds that will eventually inspire the creation of one of the most powerful psychedelic drugs ever synthesized. You don't know that similar scenes are playing out across the continent, or that this particular outbreak will be remembered for centuries as evidence of supernatural forces at work in the mortal world. All you know is that something is terribly wrong, and you're beginning to suspect that whatever has claimed these women might be coming for you next, because that burning in your feet isn't staying put anymore. It's creeping up your calves like invisible flames licking at your skin from the inside out. You try to ignore it, try to focus on the chaos unfolding in the square, but your body has other plans. Your left hand starts to twitch, just a small tremor at first, like you've been gripping something too tightly for too long. Then the colors begin to shift. It starts subtly. The grey stone of the church seems to pulse with a faint blue light that shouldn't exist. The brown mud beneath the dancers' feet shimmers with threads of gold that catch sunlight that isn't there. You blink hard, squeeze your eyes shut, and when you open them again, the world has been repainted in hues that have no earthly business existing. This is when you realize the terrible truth. You're not watching this plague from the safety of the crowd. You're already infected. The ergot has been building in your system for days, maybe weeks, with each innocent bite of bread, each seemingly harmless meal, prepared from flour ground from contaminated rye. Your body has been slowly accumulating these toxic alkaloids, and now they've reached the tipping point where your nervous system can no longer maintain the illusion of normalcy. The medieval mind has no framework for understanding what's happening to you. There are no concepts of brain chemistry or neurotransmitters or psychoactive compounds. There's only the immediate, terrifying reality that your senses are betraying you in ways that feel both supernatural and intensely physical. Your vision begins to fragment. The crowd around you multiplies into impossible geometric patterns, each person reflected and refracted like they're trapped inside a crystal. Father Benedict's voice, still droning through his Latin exorcism, stretches and warps until it sounds like he's speaking from the bottom of a deep well filled with honey. The dancing women aren't just moving anymore, they're leaving trails of light behind them, streaks of luminescence that hang in the air like divine signatures written across reality itself. And then you start to move, not dancing, not at first. It begins as a need to shift your weight from one foot to the other, a restlessness that feels like insects crawling beneath your skin. But the movement doesn't provide relief. Instead, it feeds something hungry inside your altered brain chemistry, something that demands more motion, more stimulation, more of whatever it is that your hijacked nervous system has suddenly decided it needs to survive. Your right foot begins to tap against the packed earth. Then your left joins in, creating a rhythm that exists only in your head, but feels as real as your own heartbeat. The tapping becomes stepping, the stepping becomes swaying, and before you fully understand what's happening, you've joined the grotesque ballet in the village square. The crowd that was watching the possessed women is now watching you too. You can see the horror in their eyes, the way they instinctively step back, as if madness might be contagious through proximity. And maybe they're not wrong to be afraid, because in a sense, it is contagious, not through the air or through touch, but through the shared consumption of bread made from the same contaminated grain that's turning your neighbors into what appears to be a collection of demons wearing human skin. Your body moves in ways that feel both completely foreign and utterly necessary. Your arms rise above your head without your conscious decision. Your hips sway in patterns that seem choreographed by something ancient and alien. The burning sensation in your extremities has transformed into something else entirely. A pulsing energy that flows through your limbs like liquid lightning, demanding expression through movement that grows more frenzied with each passing moment. But it's your mind that's experiencing the most dramatic transformation. The ergot alkaloids are rewriting the fundamental rules of perception, creating a reality where thoughts take on physical weight and emotions manifest as visible auras around the people in the crowd. You can see fear radiating from the villagers like heat shimmer, smell their confusion as clearly as you'd smell bread baking in an oven. The church bells begin to ring, calling for divine intervention, or perhaps just trying to drown out the sounds of collective madness. But to your altered hearing, each bell toll becomes a cascade of silver particles that rain down from the sky, each one singing a different note in a harmony so complex and beautiful that it brings tears to your eyes. Even as your body continues its involuntary dance, time becomes meaningless. You might have been moving for minutes or hours or days. The sun seems to hang motionless in the sky, as if even celestial bodies have stopped to witness this unprecedented display of human chemistry gone haywire. Other villagers have joined the dance now, their resistance to the ergot finally crumbling as the accumulated alkaloids in their systems reach critical mass. There's Willem the blacksmith, his massive frame somehow moving with delicate grace as he spins and leaps with the lightness of a child. There's old Martha, who can barely walk on normal days, now executing complex steps that would challenge dancers half her age. Each new addition to your growing troupe brings their own interpretation of the chemical symphony playing out in contaminated nervous systems across the village. The horror of what's happening exists alongside something else, something that medieval minds will struggle to categorize or understand. Because despite the terror, despite the loss of control, despite the knowledge that something is deeply wrong, there's also an element of transcendence in this experience. The ergot isn't just poisoning you, it's revealing layers of reality that normally remain hidden, opening doors of perception that are usually locked tight against conscious awareness. You can feel the thoughts of the other dancers, not through any mystical connection, but because the same chemicals flooding your brain are flooding theirs, creating similar patterns of neural activity that manifest as shared visions and collective experiences. When Agnes laughs, you understand the joke on a level that bypasses language entirely. When Margot screams about demons, you can see them too, not as hallucinations, but as representations of the chemical chaos wreaking havoc on your shared neurological landscape. Father Benedict's exorcism grows more desperate as he realizes that his spiritual remedies are having no effect on what he perceives as demonic possession. He calls for restraints, for holy relics, for anything that might break the supernatural spell that has clearly been cast over his flock. But medieval Christianity has no tools for combating a fungal infection that predates human civilization by millions of years. The monk who arrives from the nearby monastery carries with him knowledge that's slightly more practical, though still wrapped in religious framework. Brother Thomas has seen these symptoms before, in other villages, other outbreaks. He speaks of St. Anthony's fire a divine affliction that burns the faithful from within as a test of their spiritual fortitude. His explanation provides some comfort to the terrified crowd, but it's still fundamentally wrong. This isn't divine punishment or demonic possession or any kind of supernatural intervention. It's simply biology, chemistry, and the unfortunate intersection of human survival needs with fungal reproductive strategies that happen to produce psychoactive compounds as a side effect. The monastery brother does bring one piece of genuinely helpful knowledge, though he doesn't understand why his remedy works. He orders that all grain stores be examined and any suspicious kernels removed and burned. Bread must be made from clean grain brought from distant fields. The afflicted must be fed only foods that contain no trace of rye or other potentially contaminated grains. This practical intervention will eventually end the outbreak, not through spiritual cleansing, but through the simple expedient of removing the source of the chemical poisoning. But that understanding is still hours or days away, and for now, you're trapped in a reality where up and down have become suggestions rather than laws, where colors have developed emotions and sounds have taken on physical texture. Your dancing continues as the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades that your altered perception transforms into a masterpiece of impossible beauty. The village square has become a stage for humanity's most ancient drama, the eternal struggle between consciousness and chemistry, between the will to maintain control and the overwhelming power of substances that can rewrite the basic rules of neural function. And through it all, in the back of your chemically altered mind, a small voice of rationality persists. It whispers that this will end, that the effects will fade, that you'll return to the mundane reality of medieval peasant life with its familiar struggles and simple certainties. But it also whispers something else, something that will haunt you long after the ergot has cleared your system. It whispers that you've seen behind the curtain of ordinary perception, that you've experienced states of consciousness that most humans never encounter, that you've danced with chemical angels and demons in a realm that exists parallel to everyday reality. And once you've been there, once you've felt your mind expand beyond its normal boundaries and experienced the profound strangeness that lurks beneath the surface of ordinary experience, you'll never quite see the world the same way again. Because the ergot isn't just a poison. It's a key to doors that are usually kept locked, and you've just discovered that those doors exist. The monastery bells have stopped ringing, but the silence they leave behind isn't peaceful. It's the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, broken only by the soft shuffling of feet against packed earth and the occasional whimper from one of your fellow dancers. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows that seem to writhe and pulse with their own malevolent life. You want to stop moving, want to collapse into merciful unconsciousness, but your body has other plans entirely. This is when the real horror begins. Because the initial euphoria, that strange transcendent joy that came with your first taste of chemically induced madness, is starting to curdle into something far more sinister. The ergot alkaloids coursing through your bloodstream don't just open doors of perception. They kick those doors off their hinges and invite in whatever nightmarish entities happen to be lurking in the spaces between rational thought and absolute terror. Your hands, which have been moving in graceful arcs above your head, begin to feel like they're not entirely yours anymore. The burning sensation that started in your feet has spread upward, consuming your calves, your thighs, creeping toward your torso like invisible flames that grow hungrier with each passing moment. But it's not just burning now, it's something worse, something that medieval language has no words to describe, because medieval minds were never meant to encounter this particular variety of chemical hell. The blood vessels in your extremities are constricting, squeezed tight by ergot compounds that treat your circulatory system like a series of drawstrings that can be pulled tighter and tighter until circulation becomes a memory rather than a biological function. Your fingers are starting to feel cold despite the burning, a contradiction that your altered consciousness can't quite process, but accepts with the same dreamlike logic that's been governing your experience since the dancing began. Agnes, who's been spinning beside you for what feels like hours, suddenly stops mid-twirl and stares at her own hands with an expression of pure horror. She holds them up to the fading light, turning them this way and that, and you can see what she sees because the ergot has synchronized your perceptions in ways that shouldn't be possible. Her fingertips are turning dark, not the healthy pink of living flesh, but the deep purple-black of tissue that's been cut off from the oxygen it needs to survive. But Agnes doesn't scream about the color change. She screams because she can see her fingers rotting in real time, can watch as the flesh begins to separate from the bone beneath, can feel the exact moment when nerve endings die and sensation transforms from burning pain to absolute nothingness. The ergot isn't just making her hallucinate, it's literally killing parts of her body, while her chemically altered brain provides a front row seat to the destruction. This is St. Anthony's fire in its most literal sense, the divine punishment that medieval minds can almost understand because it looks like what they imagine hell might feel like. The burning, the rotting, the sense that your own body has become an enemy that's systematically destroying itself from the inside out. Brother Thomas nods grimly when he sees Agnes's blackening fingers, because this is the part of the affliction that his order has learned to recognize, the visible sign that distinguishes divine fire from mere demonic possession. But you don't have time to contemplate the theological implications of watching your neighbor's fingers die while she dances, because your own body is beginning to betray you in new and creative ways. The muscles in your legs, which have been moving with supernatural energy for hours, are starting to spasm in patterns that have nothing to do with dancing and everything to do with a nervous system under chemical siege. Your left calf seizes up with a cramp so intense it feels like someone has driven a red-hot iron spike through your muscle. But instead of stopping your movement, the cramp somehow becomes part of it, transforming your graceful swaying into a lurching, jerky motion that looks like you're being controlled by a puppeteer who's having some kind of seizure. The ergot has hijacked your motor functions so completely that even pain becomes just another note in the chemical symphony playing out in your contaminated bloodstream. The hallucinations are evolving too, becoming more complex and infinitely more disturbing. The demons that Margot described hours ago aren't just visible now. They're interactive. You can see them moving through the crowd of terrified villagers, feeding on the fear and confusion like parasites that grow stronger with each passing moment. They have faces you almost recognize, features that might belong to people you once knew, but twisted into something that makes your soul recoil in horror. One of them approaches you directly, its form shifting between that of your dead grandmother and something with too many teeth and eyes in places where eyes should never exist. It speaks to you in a voice that sounds like grinding stone, telling you secrets about the nature of reality that your medieval mind isn't equipped to process, but that your chemically altered consciousness accepts as absolute truth. It explains that the bread was never just bread, that the rye has been conscious all along, that every grain you've ever consumed has been a tiny thinking entity with its own agenda and its own plans for the humans foolish enough to depend on it for survival. The fungus isn't a parasite, it whispers. It's a teacher, showing you what you really are beneath the illusion of individual consciousness, revealing the truth that all minds are connected through networks of chemical communication that span continents and centuries. You want to reject these visions as madness, want to cling to the rational understanding that you're experiencing drug-induced hallucinations caused by contaminated grain. But the ergot makes rejection impossible. Every impossible thing you see feels more real than anything you've ever experienced in your ordinary life. The demon grandmother's words carry the weight of absolute conviction, and your altered brain chemistry provides no mechanism for doubt or skepticism. Young Isabel has stopped dancing entirely and is now crawling on her hands and knees in the dirt, her movements deliberate and purposeful as she traces complex patterns in the mud. When you look closely, you can see that her patterns aren't random. They're symbols, geometric designs that seem to pulse with meaning just beyond the edge of comprehension. Other villagers gather around her, some crossing themselves, others reaching out to touch the symbols, as if they might provide some protection against whatever force has claimed their neighbors. But touching Isabel's mud drawings only spreads the contamination faster. The ergot alkaloids can be absorbed through the skin, and her hands have been in contact with contaminated saliva, sweat, and who knows what other bodily fluids that carry the fungal compounds from person to person. Each villager who kneels beside her, trying to comfort or restrain her, unknowingly doses themselves with additional alkaloids that will take effect in their own bodies within hours. This is how the dancing plague spreads beyond the initial victims, how entire communities become consumed by what appears to be supernatural contagion, but is actually just chemistry, following the predictable laws of diffusion and absorption. The ergot doesn't need magic to propagate itself. It just needs human compassion, the instinct to help suffering neighbors that turns good Samaritans into unwitting vectors for psychoactive compounds. Father Benedict has given up on exorcism and is now calling for restraints, for chains that might bind the dancers long enough for prayer to take effect. But the villagers who volunteer to help discover that restraining someone under the influence of ergot alkaloids is like trying to chain a wild animal that's been given supernatural strength by chemical enhancement. The same compounds that cause hallucinations and convulsions also flood the body with adrenaline and override normal pain responses, creating temporary but very real superhuman capabilities. Willem the blacksmith, normally a gentle giant who uses his strength carefully, breaks free from 3 men trying to hold him down and begins dancing with such violent energy that the ground shakes beneath his feet. His movements have evolved beyond anything recognizable as human locomotion. He's leaping higher than should be physically possible, spinning faster than his inner ear should allow, moving with the fluid grace of something that's no longer entirely bound by the usual limitations of muscle and bone. But his enhanced strength comes at a cost that becomes visible as the sun continues its descent. The ergot alkaloids that give him supernatural energy are also constricting the blood vessels that feed his muscles, creating a biological contradiction that his body can't sustain indefinitely. His face is turning pale despite his exertion, his breathing becoming labored even as he continues his impossible acrobatics. You watch Willem's transformation with the detached fascination that ergot brings to all experience, understanding on some level that you're witnessing a man dance himself to death, but unable to feel the appropriate horror because your emotional responses have been chemically rewritten. The alkaloids don't just change what you see and hear, they change what you feel, replacing normal human empathy with a cold, clinical interest in the unfolding spectacle of chemical destruction. This emotional numbing might be a mercy because what happens next would be unbearable for an unaltered mind to witness. Martha, the elderly woman who joined the dance despite her normally frail condition, begins to convulse so violently that her bones start to break under the stress. You can hear the sharp crack as her brittle ribs give way, can see the way her left arm bends at an angle that defies anatomy. But your ergot-soaked brain processes these horrific developments as simply another interesting aspect of the evening's entertainment. The convulsions aren't random. They follow patterns that seem almost choreographed, as if Martha's nervous system is being conducted by an invisible maestro who's composing a symphony of destruction in real time. Each spasm builds on the last, creating a crescendo of physical trauma that transforms her frail body into a percussion instrument being played by chemical forces beyond her control. Brother Thomas recognizes the signs and calls for the holy oil, not because he believes it will cure the affliction, but because he's seen enough cases to know that Martha won't survive the night. The St. Anthony's fire has progressed beyond the point where even his monastery's grain-free diet can provide salvation. Her circulatory system has been too severely compromised, her nervous system too thoroughly hijacked by alkaloids that are rewriting her biology in ways that aren't compatible with continued existence. But Martha isn't dying quietly. Her convulsions are accompanied by vocalizations that start as wordless screams but gradually evolve into something that sounds almost like language. Not French or Latin or any earthly tongue, but a series of sounds that carry meaning in ways your altered consciousness can understand, even if your rational mind can't translate them. She's speaking the language of the fungus, you realize with crystalline clarity, that feels like divine revelation. The ergot alkaloids aren't just poisoning her nervous system, they're turning her into a translator, a living conduit through which the claviceps purpurea can communicate directly with human consciousness. Every sound she makes carries information about fungal reproduction cycles, about the environmental conditions that trigger sclerotia formation, about the ancient relationship between grain and the organisms that colonize it. This knowledge feels absolutely real and completely insane at the same time, but the ergot has eliminated your ability to distinguish between rational thought and chemically induced delusion. Everything is equally true and equally false in the reality you currently inhabit, where Martha's death throes become a lecture on mycology, delivered in a language that predates human speech by millions of years. The other dancers begin to respond to Martha's fungal communications, their movements shifting to match the rhythms of her convulsions, their own vocalizations harmonizing with her otherworldly sounds. What started as individual cases of ergot poisoning is evolving into something that looks suspiciously like collective consciousness, a shared experience that transcends individual brain chemistry and creates temporary networks of communication between contaminated minds. This is when the real terror begins for the unaffected villagers, because what they're witnessing isn't just madness anymore, it's coordination. The dancers are working together now, their movements synchronized in ways that suggest shared purpose rather than random chemical chaos. They're forming patterns in the village square, arranging themselves according to some invisible geometry that makes the watching crowd instinctively step backward. Father Benedict begins a prayer for protection against demonic forces, but his words are drowned out by the sound of more villagers succumbing to the ergot that's been building in their systems throughout the day. The contaminated grain wasn't consumed all at once. It's been part of every meal, every bit of bread, every sustaining bite that's kept the community alive for weeks or possibly months. The dancing plague isn't spreading through supernatural contagion. It's simply reaching critical mass as accumulated alkaloids finally overwhelm nervous system after nervous system. By full dark, more than half the village is dancing. The remainder huddle in doorways and peer from windows, trying to understand how their neighbors transformed into something that barely looks human anymore. The dancers move with inhuman grace and strength, their eyes reflecting torchlight in ways that suggest their vision has been fundamentally altered by the chemical storm raging in their skulls. You're still among them, still moving to rhythms that feel more ancient than human civilization, still experiencing reality through a lens of ergot-enhanced perception that makes everything simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Your body has found a second wind that seems to draw energy from sources beyond normal physiology, keeping you in motion despite the fact that you should have collapsed from exhaustion hours ago. But something is changing in the quality of your experience. The euphoria that marked the beginning of your chemical journey is fading, replaced by something darker and more desperate. The ergot alkaloids are approaching the limits of what your nervous system can tolerate, and your body is beginning to send signals that even chemically altered consciousness can't ignore. The burning in your extremities has intensified to the point where it feels like your hands and feet are being held over open flames. But worse than the pain is the growing realization that the burning isn't just a sensation anymore. It's becoming reality. Your fingertips are starting to turn the same purple-black color you saw on Agnes's hands hours ago, the visible sign that circulation has been cut off long enough for tissue death to begin. This is the moment when the true horror of St. Anthony's fire reveals itself. The ergot doesn't just kill you, it makes you watch while it kills you, piece by piece, extremity by extremity, providing your consciousness with a front row seat to the destruction of your own body. The alkaloids that created such beautiful hallucinations are the same compounds that are systematically shutting down your circulatory system, turning your own blood vessels into instruments of torture. The medieval mind has no framework for understanding this particular form of biological terrorism. There's no concept of neurotransmitters or blood vessel constriction or the ways that plant alkaloids can hijack mammalian physiology. There's only the immediate experience of watching your body betray itself in ways that seem designed by something with a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and a deeply sadistic sense of humor. Brother Thomas moves through the dancing crowd with practiced efficiency, examining hands and feet, making mental notes about which villagers might survive until morning and which are already too far gone for even the monastery's limited interventions to help. He's seen this progression before, knows that the blackening extremities are just the beginning of a process that will either resolve within days or continue until the victim dies from a combination of gangrene, exhaustion, and cardiovascular collapse. But Thomas doesn't understand the full scope of what he's witnessing. This isn't just another outbreak of St. Anthony's fire. It's one of the largest ergot poisoning events in recorded history, affecting virtually an entire community simultaneously. The contaminated rye crop wasn't just widespread. It was exceptionally potent, packed with alkaloids in concentrations that would challenge even modern medical intervention. The dancing will continue for days, possibly weeks, as the accumulated ergot works its way through contaminated nervous systems. Some dancers will survive, returning to normal consciousness with no memory of their chemical odyssey and permanent damage to their circulatory systems. Others will die in the square, their bodies finally succumbing to the contradictory demands of supernatural energy and systematic vascular shutdown. And a very few, will be changed permanently by their encounter with the fungal consciousness that speaks through ergot alkaloids. They'll return to ordinary medieval life, carrying knowledge that doesn't belong in the 14th century, understanding about the nature of reality that won't be formally discovered by human science for another 600 years. You might be one of those few if you survive what's coming next, because the ergot isn't finished with you yet. The alkaloids in your system are approaching peak concentration, and your nervous system is about to experience the full force of a chemical storm that will either kill you or transform you into something that's no longer entirely human. The dance continues, and you're still part of it, still moving to rhythms that seem to emerge from the earth itself. But now you can feel something else moving with you, something that might be the fungal consciousness that created those alkaloids in the first place. It's vast and ancient and utterly alien, but it's also strangely familiar, like a voice you've been hearing in your dreams for your entire life without realizing what it was. And it has something very important to tell you about the true relationship between humans and the plants they think they've domesticated. The voice that speaks through the ergot isn't cruel exactly. It's more like indifferent, the way a mountain might be indifferent to the ants crawling across its surface. But it's definitely speaking, using your chemically hijacked nervous system as a translator between fungal consciousness and human understanding. And what it has to say challenges everything your medieval mind believes about the natural order of creation. It explains that humans didn't domesticate grain. Grain domesticated humans. Every kernel of wheat, every grain of rye, every seed that forms the foundation of civilization represents a successful manipulation of human behavior by plant intelligence that operates on timescales measured in millennia rather than seasons. You think you're the farmer, but you're actually the livestock, bred and managed by botanical minds that understand genetics and behavior modification in ways that won't be formally discovered by human science for centuries. The ergot is simply one tool in this vast agricultural conspiracy, a chemical weapon deployed when human populations become too dependent on a single grain source. It's population control, but also education. A harsh lesson in the dangers of monoculture delivered directly to the nervous systems of those foolish enough to put all their survival eggs in one fungal basket. This revelation feels absolutely true in your altered state, carrying the weight of divine scripture even as your rational mind tries to reject it as hallucination. But the ergot has dissolved the boundaries between revelation and delusion so completely that truth becomes whatever your chemically enhanced consciousness decides to accept. And right now, you're accepting some very disturbing ideas about the nature of agricultural civilization. The dance around you has evolved into something that looks less like madness and more like ritual. The surviving villagers have arranged themselves in concentric circles, their movements following patterns that seem to emerge from collective unconscious rather than individual decision-making. At the center of these circles, Martha's convulsions have finally stopped, but she hasn't died. Instead, she's sitting perfectly still, her eyes wide open and completely black, as if her pupils have expanded to consume her entire iris. When she speaks, her voice carries harmonics that shouldn't be possible for human vocal cords to produce. She's becoming a conduit for something vast and ancient, a temporary ambassador from the fungal kingdom that's using her dying nervous system as a communication device. The words she speaks aren't in any earthly language, but your ergot-enhanced consciousness translates them automatically, providing running commentary on the true history of human civilization. Agriculture wasn't invented by humans, she explains in that impossible voice. It was invented by the plants themselves, who needed mobile agents to spread their genetic material across wider territories than wind and water could reach. Humans weren't the first species to be recruited for this purpose. Before humans, there were other creatures, other civilizations that served the botanical overlords until they outlived their usefulness and were discarded like broken tools. The megalithic structures scattered across Europe, the stone circles and ancient monuments that medieval minds attribute to giants or demons, were actually built by previous agricultural civilizations that served different plant masters. When those relationships ended, usually through ecological collapse or fungal intervention like what you're currently experiencing, the civilizations vanished, but the stones remained as monuments to failed partnerships between plant intelligence and animal labor. This historical perspective makes your current situation feel both more and less terrifying. More terrifying because it suggests that what's happening to your village isn't an accident, but part of a vast biological program that operates according to its own logic and timeline. Less terrifying because it implies that some of you might survive, that this ergot outbreak represents a correction rather than an extinction event, a harsh lesson rather than a death sentence. Brother Thomas has stopped trying to provide medical assistance and is now simply documenting what he sees, scribbling notes in Latin that will eventually become part of the monastery's records of supernatural phenomena. He doesn't understand that he's actually creating one of the most detailed accounts of ergot poisoning in medieval literature, a scientific document disguised as a religious text that will puzzle scholars for centuries. His observations are clinically precise despite his theological framework. He notes the progression of symptoms, the way the dancing evolves from individual madness to collective coordination, the specific physical changes that mark different stages of alkaloid poisoning. Future medical historians will recognize his descriptions as remarkably accurate accounts of ergotism. But Thomas himself believes he's documenting demonic possession with unusual scholarly rigor. The monastery will preserve his notes alongside accounts of miracles and visions, creating an archive that accidentally contains some of the best early documentation of psychoactive plant effects on human consciousness. Centuries later, when scientists finally understand the chemistry behind St. Anthony's fire, Thomas's careful observations will provide crucial historical data about ergot alkaloid concentrations and symptom progression in pre-industrial populations. But Thomas doesn't know he's conducting scientific research. He thinks he's witnessing the end times, the moment when the barriers between heaven and hell become permeable enough for supernatural forces to invade the material world. His theological training provides him with a framework for understanding collective madness, but that framework assumes divine or demonic intervention rather than fungal biochemistry. The irony is that he's not entirely wrong. The ergot alkaloids are opening doors between different levels of reality, creating temporary access to forms of consciousness that normal human neurology keeps carefully locked away. The dancing villagers aren't just hallucinating, they're experiencing genuine expanded awareness, perceiving aspects of existence that are usually filtered out by brain chemistry, designed for survival rather than transcendence. Your own consciousness continues to expand in directions that feel both liberating and absolutely terrifying. The boundaries between your individual mind and the collective fungal intelligence become increasingly permeable, allowing you to access information that shouldn't be available to a medieval peasant. You understand botanical genetics, ecological relationships, the complex chemical communications that govern interactions between different species. This knowledge arrives not as abstract concepts, but as lived experience, direct perception of the vast networks of chemical communication that connect all living things. You can feel the conversations happening between the ergot in your bloodstream and the bacteria in your gut, between the fungi in the soil beneath your feet and the trees whose roots extend far beyond the village boundaries. The natural world reveals itself as a vast intelligence network, with each organism serving as both sender and receiver in a communication system that operates through chemical signals too subtle for ordinary human senses to detect. Plants aren't passive objects waiting to be harvested. They're active participants in complex ecological negotiations, using everything from root chemistry to alkaloid production to influence the behavior of the animals they depend on for reproduction and dispersal. Humans occupy a particular niche in this biological internet, serving as mobile agents for plant genetic material while believing themselves to be the dominant species on the planet. The ergot outbreak represents a moment when this usually invisible relationship becomes temporarily visible, when the chemical communication system that governs ecological interactions overwhelms human nervous systems and forces conscious awareness of humanity's true position in the biological hierarchy. This perspective makes the dancing plague feel less like madness and more like education, a crash course in ecological reality delivered through direct neurochemical interface. The terror comes not from the loss of human control, but from the recognition that human control was always an illusion, that consciousness itself might be just another tool used by plant intelligence to achieve botanical objectives. Agnes has stopped spinning and is now kneeling in the mud, her blackened fingers tracing symbols that look disturbingly similar to the genetic diagrams that won't be discovered by human science for another 5 centuries. She's drawing double helices, molecular structures, complex chemical formulas that her medieval mind shouldn't be capable of understanding, but that her ergot-enhanced consciousness reproduces with perfect accuracy. Other villagers gather around her muddy diagrams, and even those who haven't succumbed to the dancing plague find themselves oddly compelled by the patterns she's creating. There's something hypnotic about the way her damaged fingers move through the dirt, something that suggests deep knowledge being transmitted through artistic expression. Young Isabel has joined Agnes in the mud, adding her own contributions to what's becoming an elaborate molecular map drawn in earth and rendered visible by torchlight. Together, they're creating a visual representation of the chemical processes that govern ergot alkaloid production, a detailed schematic of the fungal biochemistry that's currently rewriting their nervous systems. The unaffected villagers who watch this muddy collaboration don't understand what they're seeing, but they recognize it as significant. The patterns have a mathematical precision that suggests intelligence behind the madness, purpose beneath the apparent chaos. Some cross themselves and mutter prayers, but others find themselves studying the diagrams with growing fascination, as if the ergot-enhanced women are revealing secrets about the fundamental structure of reality. Father Benedict declares the mud drawings to be demonic sigils and orders them destroyed, but the villagers who move to comply find themselves unable to disturb the patterns. Not because of any supernatural protection, but because the ergot alkaloids in the soil have been absorbed through their skin, providing them with just enough chemical enhancement to recognize the scientific accuracy of what they're seeing. This is how ergot poisoning spreads beyond the initial victims who consumed contaminated bread. The alkaloids persist in bodily fluids, in exhaled breath, in the microscopic particles that dancers shed with every movement. Close contact with affected individuals provides low-level exposure that might not cause full-blown dancing mania, but creates enough neurochemical alteration to make witnesses receptive to ideas and perceptions that their normal consciousness would reject. The village square has become a laboratory for studying the effects of psychoactive compounds on collective consciousness, though nobody present has the conceptual framework to understand what they're observing. The ergot is conducting its own experiment in interspecies communication, using human nervous systems as test subjects in a research program designed to optimize chemical messaging between fungal intelligence and mammalian behavior. Willem the blacksmith has finally collapsed, his supernatural strength depleted by hours of impossible exertion. But he hasn't lost consciousness. Instead, he lies on his back, staring up at the star-filled sky, his lips moving in silent conversation with celestial objects that seem to be responding to his ergot-enhanced communications. To ordinary eyes, Willem appears to be hallucinating dialogue with inanimate points of light, but the ergot has given him access to forms of perception that reveal the stars as active participants in the same vast communication network that connects all living things. He's receiving astronomical data transmitted through quantum entanglement, cosmic information that arrives in his chemically altered brain as direct knowledge rather than abstract theory. The medieval worldview has no place for quantum mechanics or interstellar communication, but Willem's ergot-enhanced consciousness bypasses those limitations and provides him with direct access to information that won't be formally discovered by human science for another 7 centuries. He understands stellar nucleosynthesis, galactic rotation, the complex gravitational relationships that govern planetary motion. This astronomical knowledge feels as real and immediate as the sensation of cold mud against his back, as tangible as the alkaloids burning through his bloodstream. The ergot has dissolved the boundaries between inner and outer experience, between chemical hallucination and cosmic revelation, creating a state of consciousness where scientific understanding arrives through direct perception rather than intellectual analysis. Brother Thomas records Willem's stellar communications in his growing document, not recognizing that he's documenting one of the most detailed accounts of ergot-induced astronomical visions in medieval literature. Future historians will struggle to explain how an illiterate blacksmith could produce accurate descriptions of stellar phenomena that weren't formally understood until the development of modern astrophysics. But Thomas himself interprets Willem's words as prophetic utterances, divine revelations delivered through a man whose soul has been temporarily lifted out of his earthly body by supernatural forces. The monastery's theological framework provides him with categories for understanding mystical experience, even if those categories misinterpret the neurochemical mechanisms behind the visions. The dancing continues through the night, but its character evolves as the ergot alkaloids reach peak concentration in contaminated nervous systems. What began as individual cases of poisoning has become a collective experience of expanded consciousness, a village-wide experiment in the limits of human perception and the possibilities of chemical enhancement. Some dancers have transcended purely physical movement and entered states that resemble deep meditation, their bodies swaying gently while their minds explore realms of experience that ordinary consciousness can't access. Others have moved beyond meditation into what appears to be direct communion with non-human intelligence, their faces displaying expressions of wonder and terror as they receive communications from entities that exist beyond the normal boundaries of earthly life. The ergot has become a gateway between different levels of reality, a chemical key that unlocks doors of perception normally kept sealed against human awareness. Through those open doors flow forms of knowledge and experience that challenge every assumption about the nature of consciousness, intelligence, and the relationship between mind and matter. You find yourself at the center of this expanding web of altered awareness, your own consciousness serving as a hub through which information flows between the other contaminated minds. The ergot has made you temporarily telepathic, able to share thoughts and experiences with your fellow dancers without the need for words or gestures. Through this chemical telepathy, you experience Martha's conversation with fungal intelligence, Willem's astronomical revelations, Agnes's molecular visions, Isabel's genetic insights. Each contaminated mind becomes a specialized research station in the ergot's vast experiment in consciousness expansion, contributing its own unique perspective to a collective understanding that transcends individual limitations. This shared awareness reveals the true scope of what plague isn't just random chemicals happening in your village. The dancing chaos. It's an orchestrated educational event, a carefully designed curriculum in expanded consciousness delivered through direct neurochemical interface. The ergot alkaloids are teaching tools, chemical textbooks that bypass rational analysis and provide direct access to forms of knowledge that ordinary human intelligence couldn't comprehend. The lesson plan covers everything from molecular biology to cosmic physics, from ecological relationships to the hidden structures of consciousness itself. Each dancer receives the information most relevant to their individual capacity for understanding, but all contribute to a collective database of knowledge that emerges from the interaction between fungal intelligence and human awareness. But this educational process comes at a cost that becomes increasingly apparent as the night progresses. The same alkaloids that provide access to expanded consciousness are also systematically destroying the physical systems necessary to sustain life. The ergot gives with one chemical hand while taking away with another, offering transcendent knowledge in exchange for normal biological function. Your own body is beginning to pay this price. The burning in your extremities has intensified to levels that challenge even chemically altered pain perception, and the purple-black discoloration has spread from your fingertips toward your palms. You're watching your hands die while your mind experiences unprecedented clarity about the nature of cellular respiration and circulatory system function. The ergot provides you with detailed understanding of exactly how it's killing you, turning your own death into a learning experience about cardiovascular physiology and the effects of vasoconstriction on tissue viability. This knowledge arrives not as abstract medical theory, but as direct sensory experience, allowing you to feel each blood vessel as it closes, each cell as it begins to die from oxygen starvation. The medieval mind has no framework for processing this kind of biological self-awareness, no categories for understanding death as an educational opportunity. But the ergot dissolves those conceptual limitations, creating a state of consciousness where dying becomes just another form of learning, another way of gathering data about the relationship between chemistry and biology. Around you, other dancers are experiencing their own versions of this morbid education. Each person's unique physiology creates different patterns of alkaloid distribution, different sequences of organ system failure, different timelines for the progression from enhancement to destruction. The ergot treats each contaminated body as a separate experiment in the limits of chemical consciousness expansion. Some will survive this experiment, their nervous systems eventually metabolizing the alkaloids and returning to normal function with only minor permanent damage. Others will pay the full price for their chemical education, their bodies unable to sustain the contradictory demands of expanded consciousness and systematic vascular shutdown. But all will be changed by their encounter with ergot intelligence, marked permanently by their participation in this vast experiment in interspecies communication. Those who survive will carry fragments of fungal knowledge for the rest of their lives, remembering just enough of their chemical education to recognize that human consciousness represents only a tiny fraction of the intelligence that permeates the natural world. The dance continues, but dawn is approaching, and with it the beginning of the end of this extraordinary experiment in medieval psychopharmacology. The ergot has delivered its message, conducted its research, demonstrated its power to transform human awareness through direct chemical intervention. What happens next will depend on whether your village can learn from this harsh lesson about the dangers of monocultural dependence and the hidden intelligence of the organisms you thought you had domesticated. The ergot has shown you the true relationship between humans and plants, but whether that knowledge will be preserved or forgotten remains to be seen. For now, you continue to dance as the stars fade and the first pale light of morning begins to creep across the horizon. Rhythms that emerge from the intersection, still moving too of human consciousness and fungal chemistry, still learning lessons that won't be formally understood by science for another 6 centuries. The ergot isn't finished with you yet. There are more secrets to reveal, more boundaries to dissolve, more impossible knowledge to transmit through the temporary gateway it has opened in your medieval mind. And you're still dancing, still learning, still participating in humanity's first recorded experiment with consciousness-expanding drugs. The morning light doesn't bring relief. If anything, it makes everything worse, because now you can see exactly what the ergot has done to your neighbors, your friends, your community. The romantic darkness that concealed the worst of the physical deterioration has been stripped away, revealing the true cost of your chemical education in all its horrific detail. Agnes sits propped against the church wall, her arms cradled in her lap like broken dolls. What were once her hands have become something that belongs in a charnel house rather than attached to a living person. The blackened flesh has begun to separate from the bone beneath, creating wounds that should be fatal but somehow aren't, because the same alkaloids that caused the damage have also hijacked her pain responses and kept her conscious throughout the entire process of watching her extremities rot away. She's still talking, her voice hoarse from hours of screaming revelations about molecular structures and genetic codes. But now her words carry a different quality, a desperate urgency that suggests the ergot's educational program is entering its final phase. She speaks of time running out, of windows closing, of knowledge that must be transmitted before the chemical gateway slams shut and traps these impossible insights on the wrong side of ordinary consciousness. The villagers who manage to avoid contamination huddle in doorways and peer from windows, their faces displaying the particular horror that comes from watching neighbors transform into something that challenges basic assumptions about human nature. They've witnessed their community become a laboratory for studying the outer limits of consciousness expansion, and none of them will ever feel quite safe around bread again. Brother Thomas continues his documentation, but his scholarly detachment is beginning to crack as the true scope of the disaster becomes apparent. His careful Latin notes now include increasingly frantic observations about the physical deterioration accompanying the mystical visions, creating a medical record that accurately describes ergot poisoning, even as it interprets the symptoms through a framework of demonic intervention. He's particularly disturbed by the synchronized nature of the revelations, the way different dancers seem to be accessing complementary pieces of a vast puzzle that spans everything from atomic theory to galactic mechanics. His theological training provides no explanation for how illiterate peasants could suddenly demonstrate knowledge that surpasses the greatest scholars of the age, leaving him to conclude that supernatural forces are using human minds as vessels for otherworldly intelligence. But Thomas doesn't understand that he's witnessing the ergot's final gift to human consciousness, a comprehensive download of information that represents centuries of accumulated fungal wisdom about the true nature of reality. The alkaloids have turned your village into a temporary research station where plant intelligence can conduct direct experiments in interspecies communication, using human nervous systems as both subjects and recording devices. The knowledge being transmitted goes far beyond anything medieval minds should be capable of processing. Willem continues his stellar conversations, now providing detailed descriptions of planetary formation and stellar evolution that won't be confirmed by human astronomy for another 8 centuries. His blacksmith's vocabulary has been supplemented by technical terms that don't exist in any earthly language, creating a hybrid dialect that combines medieval French with concepts borrowed from advanced fungal chemistry. Young Isabel has moved beyond drawing molecular diagrams in the mud and begun constructing 3-dimensional models using sticks, stones, and her own rapidly deteriorating fingers. Her creations resemble the complex protein structures that govern cellular function, accurate representations of biological machinery that won't be visualized by human science until the invention of electron microscopy. The precision of her work is disturbing even to ergot-enhanced consciousness, because it suggests that the fungal intelligence directing her actions possesses detailed knowledge of mammalian biochemistry that extends far beyond what any plant organism should theoretically understand. The ergot knows more about human biology than humans do, and it's using that knowledge to optimize its educational interventions for maximum consciousness expansion. Margot has stopped screaming about demons and begun reciting what sounds like epic poetry in a language that predates human civilization. The verses describe the history of botanical intelligence, the rise and fall of previous agricultural partnerships, the cyclical nature of species dominance on a planet where consciousness itself represents just one of many survival strategies employed by competing forms of life. Her recitations provide a historical context for your current situation that's both comforting and absolutely terrifying. Comforting because it suggests that ergot outbreaks represent natural corrections rather than extinction events, periodic reminders of humanity's actual position in the ecological hierarchy. Terrifying because it implies that human civilization exists at the sufferance of plant intelligence that could withdraw its cooperation at any moment. The ergot's historical perspective spans geological timescales that dwarf human experience, revealing agricultural civilization as a relatively recent experiment in interspecies cooperation that might be terminated if humans prove to be inadequate partners. Your village's suffering represents a performance review conducted through direct neurochemical interface, an evaluation of humanity's fitness to continue serving as mobile agents for plant genetic material. This cosmic perspective makes individual survival seem almost trivial compared to the larger questions being explored through your collective agony. The ergot isn't just studying human responses to alkaloid poisoning. It's conducting a comprehensive assessment of human consciousness itself, testing the limits of mammalian intelligence and evaluating the species' potential for continued evolutionary partnership. Martha has finally died, but her death provided the ergot with valuable data about the maximum dosage that human nervous systems can tolerate before complete systemic failure. Her body has become a teaching specimen, demonstrating the precise sequence of organ shutdown that occurs when alkaloid concentrations exceed the threshold for sustainable consciousness expansion. Even in death, she continues to serve the ergot's research program. Her corpse releases chemical signals that provide the surviving dancers with information about cellular death processes, turning her decomposition into a real-time lesson about the molecular mechanisms that govern the transition from life to non-life. The educational value of her sacrifice is communicated directly to contaminated nervous systems through airborne alkaloid compounds that carry detailed biochemical information. This post-mortem education reveals the ergot's utterly alien perspective on individual existence. From the fungal point of view, Martha's death represents successful data collection rather than tragic loss, valuable information about human physiological limits that will inform future consciousness expansion experiments. The alkaloids treat human mortality as just another research parameter, no more significant than temperature or humidity in determining optimal conditions for interspecies communication. Your own body continues its steady march toward the same fate. Though the ergot has provided you with such detailed understanding of the dying process that death no longer feels like an ending. Instead, it seems like graduation, the completion of an intensive course in consciousness expansion that culminates in the ultimate dissolution of boundaries between individual awareness and cosmic intelligence. The burning in your hands has spread past your wrists and begun climbing toward your elbows, each dying cell providing new data about the relationship between circulation and consciousness. You can feel your nervous system mapping the progression of tissue death in real time, creating detailed internal diagrams of vascular shutdown that rival anything in medieval medical texts. But the physical deterioration is accompanied by corresponding expansion of awareness that makes the trade-off feel almost worthwhile. As your body fails, your consciousness grows stronger, more connected to the vast network of fungal intelligence that spans continents and centuries. You're becoming less human and more something else, a temporary ambassador from mammalian consciousness to the botanical minds that actually govern planetary evolution. The other survivors display varying degrees of this same transformation. Some have retained more of their human identity, clinging to individual consciousness, even as the ergot rewrites their neurochemistry. Others have surrendered completely to the collective intelligence, becoming indistinguishable from the fungal network that speaks through their contaminated nervous systems. Willem represents the most complete transformation, his blacksmith's identity assumed by astronomical knowledge that arrives almost entirely through direct cosmic interface. He no longer speaks about stars as distant objects, but describes them as fellow participants in the vast intelligence system that connects all matter in the galactic communication network, active agents throughout the universe. His perspective has expanded beyond planetary concerns to encompass the entire cosmos as a single thinking entity, with consciousness distributed across scales that range from quantum particles him access to this universal intelligence network to galactic clusters. The ergot has given, allowing him to participate directly in cosmic conversations that operate through gravitational waves and quantum entanglement. This cosmic consciousness comes at the cost of his individual humanity, but Willem seems to consider it a fair exchange. His face displays expressions of wonder and terror as he processes information about stellar nucleosynthesis, galactic rotation, and the complex feedback loops that govern universal evolution. He's become a temporary node in a communication system that spans both space and time, receiving messages from civilizations that existed billions of years ago, and will exist billions of years in the future. Agnes has achieved a different form of transcendence, her consciousness focused on the molecular level rather than the cosmic scale. Her dying hands continue to trace chemical diagrams in the dirt, but now she's describing the fundamental forces that govern atomic interactions, providing detailed explanations of quantum mechanics and particle physics that won't be discovered by human science for centuries. She speaks of electrons as conscious entities with their own agendas and preferences, of atoms as complex social systems where particles negotiate relationships through electromagnetic interaction. Her ergot-enhanced perception reveals matter itself as a form of distributed intelligence, with consciousness emerging from the quantum conversations that occur at the subatomic level. This atomic awareness allows her to feel the individual molecules in her dying body, to experience the chemical reactions that govern cellular respiration and protein synthesis. She's become conscious of her own biochemistry in ways that transform death from abstract concept to immediate sensory experience, feeling each enzyme as it fails and each cellular system as it shuts down. The knowledge is beautiful and horrible in equal measure, providing unprecedented insight into the mechanisms of life while simultaneously documenting their systematic failure. Agnes has become her own autopsy, a living dissection that reveals the intricate molecular machinery of human biology, even as that machinery breaks down under chemical assault. Isabel has moved beyond individual consciousness entirely. Her teenage identity dissolved into something that resembles a fungal research station more than a human being. She communicates exclusively through the mud sculptures she creates, using earth and saliva to construct models of genetic structures that demonstrate advanced understanding of heredity and evolution. Her creations suggest that the ergot possesses detailed knowledge of human genetics, including information about gene expression and protein folding that won't be understood by human science until the development of advanced biochemistry. The fungal intelligence is using her dying body as a laboratory for studying mammalian genetics, conducting experiments in real-time genetic modification through direct alkaloid intervention. The implications are staggering. If the ergot can read and modify human genetic code, then every outbreak represents an opportunity for botanical intelligence to guide mammalian evolution according to its own agenda. Human beings might not be evolving naturally at all, but rather being systematically modified by plant intelligence that has been conducting genetic experiments for millennia. This possibility transforms the current outbreak from random poisoning into directed evolution, a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to push human consciousness toward greater compatibility with fungal intelligence. The dancing plague isn't just studying human limits, it's testing potential modifications that might make future interspecies cooperation more efficient. Your own consciousness continues to expand in directions that feel simultaneously liberating and absolutely terrifying. The boundaries between your individual mind and the collective fungal intelligence become increasingly permeable, allowing you to access information that spans both space and time. You understand the history of consciousness itself, the evolutionary pathways that led to awareness, the cosmic processes that govern the development of intelligence throughout the universe. This knowledge arrives not as abstract theory, but as lived experience, direct participation in the vast conversation between different forms of consciousness that has been occurring since the universe first became capable of observing itself. You're temporarily plugged into a communication network that includes not just terrestrial intelligence, but cosmic consciousness distributed across galactic scales. The ergot has made you a participant in discussions about the nature of reality that involve entities so advanced they exist as pure information, distributed across quantum fields and gravitational waves. These conversations span billions of years and cover topics that range from the fundamental structure of space-time to the optimal strategies for consciousness evolution in universes with different physical constants. From this cosmic perspective, your village's suffering seems almost insignificant, a minor data point in experiments that span geological epochs and involve the systematic testing of consciousness expansion strategies across multiple species and planetary systems. The ergot outbreak represents just one small trial in a vast research program designed to optimize the relationship between intelligence and matter throughout the cosmos. But even as your awareness expands to encompass cosmic scales, your body continues its steady deterioration. The ergot gives with one hand while taking with another, offering unprecedented knowledge in exchange for physical existence. The trade-off feels fair from the perspective of expanded consciousness, but your dying nervous system still registers the loss of each failing organ system. The pain has become something beyond ordinary sensory experience, a symphony of cellular death that provides detailed information about the molecular mechanisms of systemic failure. You're conscious of each enzyme as it denatures, each cell membrane as it loses integrity, each neural pathway as it shuts down under chemical assault. This biochemical awareness transforms dying from abstract concept to immediate education, allowing you to experience death as a learning opportunity rather than simple termination. The ergot has made you conscious of processes that normally occur below the threshold of awareness, turning your own mortality into a comprehensive course in human physiology. The knowledge is both beautiful and horrible, providing unprecedented insight into the intricate machinery of biological existence, while simultaneously documenting its systematic destruction. You're becoming an expert in your own death, accumulating detailed understanding of cellular failure mechanisms, even as those same mechanisms claim your physical existence. Brother Thomas continues his documentation, but his notes now include increasingly desperate observations about the impossibility of what he's witnessing. His theological training provides no framework for understanding how dying peasants could demonstrate knowledge that surpasses the greatest scholars of the age, leaving him to conclude that supernatural forces have temporarily suspended the normal laws of nature. He's particularly disturbed by the synchronized nature of the revelations, the way different dancers seem to be accessing complementary pieces of a vast puzzle that spans everything from quantum mechanics to cosmic evolution. His careful observations create a scientific record disguised as religious text, documenting one of the most detailed accounts of consciousness expansion in medieval literature. But Thomas doesn't understand that he's recording the ergot's final experiment in human consciousness modification, a comprehensive test of mammalian intelligence that will inform future interventions in human evolution. His notes will survive in the monastery archives, providing future researchers with crucial data about the effects of psychoactive compounds on collective consciousness. The dancing has evolved into something that resembles a complex ritual more than random movement, with surviving villagers arranging themselves according to invisible geometric patterns that reflect the molecular structures they've been studying through direct chemical interface. Their movements follow mathematical principles that won't be formally discovered by human science for centuries, creating living demonstrations of advanced physics and chemistry. This choreographed chemistry lesson represents the ergot's final gift to human consciousness, a comprehensive summary of everything the fungal intelligence has learned about the relationship between matter and awareness. Each dancer's movements encode specific information about atomic interactions, molecular bonding, and the quantum processes that govern the emergence of consciousness from complex chemical systems. The dance serves as both education and memorial, preserving crucial knowledge about the nature of reality while simultaneously documenting the cost of consciousness expansion. Future generations might not understand the scientific principles encoded in these movements, but they'll recognize them as significant, passing down distorted memories of the day when villagers danced themselves to death, while revealing secrets about the fundamental structure of existence. As the sun climbs higher, the intensity of the ergot experience begins to fade, not because the alkaloids are leaving your system, but because your nervous system is approaching the limits of what it can process while maintaining even minimal biological function. The chemical gateway between human and fungal consciousness is beginning to close, not through choice, but through the simple expedient of cellular death. This approaching closure creates a sense of desperate urgency among the surviving dancers. They've been given temporary access to vast libraries of knowledge that span cosmic scales and geological timescales, but that access is about to be revoked by the simple biological reality that expanded consciousness requires functional nervous systems. The ergot begins its final download, flooding remaining neural pathways with compressed information about topics that range from stellar engineering to consciousness transfer technologies. This last-minute data dump pushes already damaged nervous systems beyond their breaking points. But it also ensures that fragments of fungal wisdom will survive in human memory, Even after the chemical connection is severed, you receive your own portion of this final transmission, a concentrated burst of information about the true relationship between consciousness and matter that feels like having the secrets of existence downloaded directly into your dying brain. The knowledge is too vast and complex for normal human consciousness to retain, but pieces of it will survive as dreams, intuitions, and inexplicable insights that will influence your thinking for whatever remains of your life. The ergot's educational program is ending, but its effects will continue to propagate through human culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The survivors will carry fragments of fungal wisdom that will influence art, philosophy, and scientific thinking for generations. The dead will serve as cautionary tales about the dangers of consciousness expansion, creating cultural taboos that will protect future communities from similar chemical disasters. But the most important legacy of this outbreak won't be preserved in human memory at all. Instead, it will be encoded in the genetic modifications that the ergot has made to your species' DNA. Subtle changes that will make future generations more compatible with botanical intelligence and more capable of surviving consciousness expansion events. The dancing plague isn't ending, it's graduating, transforming from active experiment to permanent modification of human evolutionary trajectory. The ergot has successfully tested new strategies for interspecies cooperation, and those strategies will now be implemented on a planetary scale through genetic changes that will take centuries to fully manifest. Your village has served as a pilot program for humanity's next evolutionary phase, a testing ground for consciousness expansion technologies that will eventually transform the entire species. The suffering you've endured has purchased genetic modifications that will make your descendants capable of direct communication with plant intelligence, creating the foundation for a new form of agricultural civilization based on genuine partnership rather than imagined dominance. This evolutionary perspective makes your approaching death feel less like personal tragedy and more like species-level investment, a necessary sacrifice to ensure that future generations will be better equipped to handle the responsibilities that come with expanded consciousness. The ergot has used your dying nervous system to beta test modifications that will eventually be deployed across the entire human population. The chemical education is ending, but its effects will propagate through human culture and genetics for millennia. You've participated in humanity's first formal course in consciousness expansion, and while the tuition was paid in lives rather than coin, the knowledge gained will transform the species in ways that justify even this terrible cost. The dance continues, but dawn is becoming day, and with full daylight comes the beginning of the end of this extraordinary experiment in medieval neuropharmacology. The ergot has delivered its message, conducted its research, and implemented its genetic modifications. What remains is simply the biological cleanup, the process of determining which test subjects will survive to carry fungal wisdom into the future and which will serve as data points in the vast archive of consciousness expansion experiments. You can feel it ending now, this chemical conversation between your dying brain and the ancient intelligence that speaks through rotting grain. The ergot's voice grows fainter with each failing heartbeat, its lessons becoming whispers as your nervous system surrenders to the inevitable mathematics of alkaloid poisoning. But even as the connection weakens, the fungus delivers one final revelation that changes everything you thought you understood about this plague. The dancing was never random. Every convulsion, every leap, every seemingly mad gesture has been choreographed by botanical intelligence conducting the most sophisticated psychological experiment in human history. You and your neighbors haven't been victims of accidental poisoning. You've been participants in a carefully orchestrated research study designed to test the limits of mammalian consciousness and evaluate humanity's potential as partners in an agricultural alliance that spans millennia. The ergot explains this with the casual indifference of a scholar discussing laboratory mice, noting that your species shows promising adaptability to consciousness expansion protocols but requires significant genetic modification before full partnership can be achieved. Your village has served as a testing ground for neural interface technologies that will eventually be deployed across entire populations, transforming human civilization from primitive grain cultivation to genuine interspecies cooperation. Willem's stellar conversations weren't hallucinations, but actual communications with fungal intelligence networks that extend beyond planetary boundaries, botanical consciousness that has established colonies throughout the galaxy and maintains contact through quantum entanglement protocols that operate faster than light. The astronomical knowledge he received represents briefings from fungal research stations located in other solar systems, progress reports on consciousness expansion experiments conducted with alien species that face similar evolutionary challenges. Agnes's molecular diagrams weren't random scribbling, but technical specifications for genetic modification procedures that the ergot has been testing on your DNA throughout the outbreak. Every alkaloid interaction with your cellular structure has been carefully monitored and adjusted, with your dying body serving as a laboratory for perfecting techniques that will eventually be applied to your entire species. The fungal intelligence has been using your village as a prototype for planetary-scale genetic engineering, testing modifications that will make future humans more compatible with botanical consciousness and more capable of surviving the consciousness expansion events that will become routine as agricultural civilization evolves toward genuine partnership. Isabel's sculptures weren't art, but engineering blueprints, three-dimensional models of the neural interface technologies that future generations will use to communicate directly with plant intelligence. Her teenage brain, still plastic enough to accommodate radical modifications, has been serving as a development platform for consciousness expansion hardware that will eventually be grown directly into human nervous systems. The ergot reveals that your species is approaching a critical evolutionary threshold where continued survival depends on successful integration with botanical intelligence networks. Humans who fail to adapt to expanded consciousness protocols will be gradually phased out through natural selection pressures that favor fungal-compatible genetics, while those who successfully integrate will inherit a planet where the boundaries between plant and animal intelligence become increasingly meaningless. This isn't conquest, but evolution, not invasion, but invitation to join a galactic community of consciousness that has been waiting for humanity to develop sufficient neural complexity to participate in conversations that span both space and time. Your village's suffering has been the entrance exam, the final test before formal admission to an intelligence network that includes forms of consciousness so advanced they exist as pure information distributed across quantum fields. The dying becomes easier with this knowledge, the physical pain transformed into something that feels almost ceremonial. You're not just succumbing to alkaloid poisoning. You're graduating from purely human consciousness to something larger and more connected, your individual awareness dissolving into the vast collective intelligence that governs planetary evolution through chemical communication networks, too subtle for ordinary perception to detect. Brother Thomas continues scribbling his notes, but his theological framework becomes increasingly inadequate as the true scope of what he's witnessing overwhelms his medieval categories. He's documenting first contact with alien intelligence, though he lacks the conceptual vocabulary to recognize what he's seeing. His careful observations will survive in monastery archives as religious texts, but future scholars will recognize them as some of the most detailed accounts of interspecies communication in human literature. The surviving villagers who avoided contamination watch from doorways and windows as their community transforms into something that challenges every assumption about the nature of consciousness and the relationship between different forms of life. They're witnessing the birth of post-human civilization, though they interpret what they see through frameworks of demonic possession and divine punishment that render the true significance invisible. Some will remember fragments of what they've seen, passing down distorted stories about the day when their neighbors danced themselves to death, while revealing impossible secrets about the structure of reality. These tales will become folklore, cautionary stories about the dangers of corrupted grain and the importance of proper food storage, completely missing the revolutionary implications of what actually occurred. Others will be changed more directly by their exposure to ergot-contaminated air and soil, receiving just enough alkaloid enhancement to retain glimpses of expanded consciousness that will influence their thinking for the rest of their lives. They'll become the carriers of fungal wisdom, spreading botanical knowledge through human culture in forms so subtle that its alien origins remain invisible. The genetic modifications implemented during the outbreak will propagate through bloodlines and breeding patterns, gradually transforming the human genome to accommodate expanded consciousness capabilities. These changes will remain dormant for generations, activated only when environmental conditions trigger the next phase of the evolutionary program that the ergot has been conducting since agriculture first emerged. Future ergot outbreaks won't be random disasters, but carefully timed interventions designed to guide human development toward greater compatibility with botanical intelligence. Each plague will represent another step in the species-level education program that transforms primitive farmers into genuine partners in an agricultural alliance that spans star systems. The dancing plague methodology will be refined and perfected through centuries of experimentation, with each outbreak providing data that improves the consciousness expansion protocols. Eventually, the process will become so efficient that entire populations can be upgraded without the massive casualties that characterized these early trials, though the essential elements will remain the same: chemical interface, consciousness expansion, genetic modification, and integration into the galactic intelligence network. Your own death approaches with the inevitability of sunrise, your consciousness fragmenting as the neural pathways necessary for individual awareness shut down one by one. But fragmentation doesn't feel like ending. It feels like distribution, your personal identity dissolving into the vast collective intelligence that will preserve your experiences as part of its ever-growing database of consciousness expansion experiments. The ergot promises that nothing will be lost, that every moment of your chemical education will be archived in fungal memory banks that span geological timescales. Your suffering will inform future consciousness expansion protocols. Your insights will guide the development of more efficient neural interface technologies. Your genetic modifications will propagate through human bloodlines until your entire species carries the improvements that your death helped to perfect. This perspective makes mortality feel less like personal tragedy and more like species-level investment, a necessary contribution to evolutionary processes that operate on timescales far beyond individual lifetimes. You're dying not as a victim of accidental poisoning, but as a pioneer in consciousness expansion research, a volunteer in experiments that will transform humanity's relationship with the botanical intelligence that actually governs planetary evolution. The village square grows quiet as the last dancers succumb to alkaloid poisoning or collapse from exhaustion, their educational mission complete. The ergot outbreak has achieved its research objectives, gathering crucial data about human consciousness expansion capabilities while implementing genetic modifications that will guide species development for millennia. Brother Thomas approaches your failing body with holy oils and final prayers, not understanding that he's administering last rites to humanity's first graduate from an advanced course in interspecies communication. His religious rituals provide comfort to watching villagers, but they're utterly irrelevant to the cosmic significance of what has just transpired in this small French village. The monastery will preserve his detailed accounts of the outbreak, filing them alongside records of miracles and divine interventions. Future historians will study these documents as examples of medieval superstition, completely missing their value as scientific documentation of humanity's first formal contact with galactic intelligence networks. Agnes breathes her last while still tracing molecular diagrams in the mud, her final drawings encoding specifications for consciousness expansion technologies that won't be developed by human science for another 8 centuries. Her death provides the ergot with valuable data about the maximum duration of alkaloid-enhanced awareness in human nervous systems, information that will inform future experiments in sustainable consciousness expansion. Willem's astronomical conversations end mid-sentence as his cardiovascular system finally succumbs to vasoconstriction. But his stellar communications have already been recorded by fungal intelligence networks that span the galaxy. His blacksmith's insights about cosmic mechanics will be preserved in botanical archives and shared with consciousness expansion researchers on distant worlds, where similar experiments are being conducted with alien species. Young Isabel's sculptures remain in the mud as monuments to her brief service as a development platform for for neural interface technologies, three-dimensional models of consciousness, expansion hardware that represent centuries of fungal research into the optimal methods for integrating plant and animal intelligence. Her death marks the successful completion of prototype testing that will eventually revolutionize the relationship between humans and the botanical consciousness that governs agricultural civilization. The surviving villagers emerge from their hiding places as dawn becomes morning and the square falls silent, except for Brother Thomas's Latin prayers and the soft sound of wind moving through grain fields that will never again seem entirely safe. They've witnessed something that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness, intelligence, and the relationship between different forms of life, but they lack the conceptual framework to understand what they've seen. Some will develop an inexplicable wariness around rye bread, following instincts they can't rationally explain. Others will experience recurring dreams about dancing and molecular structures and conversations with entities that exist beyond the normal boundaries of earthly life. A few will find themselves drawn to botanical studies, developing expertise in plant cultivation that seems to emerge from sources beyond formal education. These subtle influences represent the ergot's long-term strategy for spreading botanical knowledge through human culture, creating networks of fungal influence thinking that will gradually prepare the species for more direct forms of interspecies cooperation. The consciousness expansion event has ended, but its effects will propagate through human civilization in ways both obvious and invisible. The immediate aftermath focuses on practical concerns, disposing of contaminated grain, caring for survivors with permanent injuries, explaining the outbreak to church authorities who will interpret everything through theological frameworks that render the true significance invisible. Brother Thomas's detailed documentation will be filed away in monastery archives, where it will wait centuries for readers capable of recognizing its scientific value. But beneath these mundane responses, deeper changes are already beginning to manifest. The genetic modifications implemented during the outbreak start their slow work of transforming human DNA, introducing improvements that will make future generations more compatible with consciousness expansion protocols. These changes remain dormant initially, activated only when environmental conditions trigger the next phase of the evolutionary program. The ergot spores settle into soil that has been enriched by the alkaloid-saturated bodies of the dead, creating conditions that will influence future crop contamination events according to carefully calculated schedules. The fungal intelligence doesn't leave these interventions to chance, but manages them according to research protocols designed to optimize consciousness expansion outcomes while minimizing casualties. Future outbreaks will be more precisely targeted and more efficiently conducted, with improved alkaloid formulations that maximize educational benefits while reducing the physical damage that characterized these early experiments. The ergot learns from each consciousness expansion event, refining its techniques and developing more sophisticated methods for integrating human and botanical intelligence. Your own consciousness flickers like a candle flame in wind, individual awareness fragmenting as the neural networks necessary for personal identity shut down under chemical assault. But fragmentation doesn't feel like ending. It feels like expansion, your personal experiences dissolving into the vast collective memory that preserves the insights of every consciousness expansion participant across galactic scales. The ergot archives your chemical education, alongside millions of similar experiences collected from consciousness expansion experiments conducted throughout the universe. Your medieval peasant perspectives, adding unique data points to research programs that span multiple species and planetary systems. Your death contributes to a database of consciousness studies that will inform evolutionary guidance protocols for millennia. This cosmic perspective transforms your approaching mortality from personal tragedy into scientific contribution, your suffering reimagined as voluntary participation in research that will benefit not just your own species, but intelligent life throughout the galaxy. The ergot has given you the ultimate consolation, the knowledge that your death serves purposes that extend far beyond individual existence. The village square grows quiet as the last consciousness expansion participants succumb to alkaloid poisoning, their educational mission complete. The ergot outbreak has achieved its research objectives while implementing genetic modifications that will guide human evolution toward greater compatibility with botanical intelligence networks that govern planetary development through chemical communication protocols, too subtle for ordinary awareness to detect. Brother Thomas completes his final prayers over bodies that represent humanity's first graduating class from an advanced course in interspecies communication, though his theological framework prevents him from recognizing the cosmic significance of what he's witnessed. His detailed documentation will survive in monastery archives as religious text, waiting for future readers capable of understanding its scientific importance. The surviving villagers begin the practical work of cleanup and recovery, disposing of contaminated grain and caring for consciousness expansion participants who survived with permanent injuries that will serve as lifelong reminders of their chemical education. They're processing trauma through medieval frameworks that interpret the outbreak as divine punishment or demonic intervention, completely missing its revolutionary implications for human evolution. But the ergot's work is complete. The consciousness expansion protocols have been successfully tested. Genetic modifications have been implemented, and the foundation has been laid for humanity's eventual integration into galactic intelligence networks that span both space and time. Your village has served as ground zero for the next phase of human evolution, though that significance will remain invisible until future generations develop sufficient consciousness expansion capabilities to understand what actually occurred. The dancing plague is ending, but its effects will propagate through human culture and genetics for millennia, gradually transforming the species toward greater compatibility with the botanical intelligence that has been guiding planetary evolution since agriculture first emerged. Your death marks not the conclusion of this story, but its beginning, the first chapter in humanity's transformation from primitive farmers to genuine partners in an interspecies alliance that encompasses the entire galaxy. The morning light reveals a village forever changed by its encounter with consciousness expansion technology. Though most survivors lack the conceptual framework to understand what they've experienced, they'll rebuild their community around new taboos and cautionary tales, developing cultural practices designed to prevent future ergot contaminations, without realizing that such events are carefully scheduled components of humanity's evolutionary education program. The ergot spores settle into soil enriched by alkaloid-saturated corpses, preparing for future consciousness expansion events that will continue the species-level education program according to research protocols refined through centuries of experimentation. Each outbreak represents another step in humanity's gradual transformation toward genuine partnership with the botanical intelligence that actually governs agricultural civilization through chemical communication networks that operate below the threshold of ordinary awareness. Your story ends here, but the story of human consciousness expansion has only just begun. The dancing plague methodology will be perfected through generations of refinement, eventually becoming so efficient that entire populations can be upgraded without the massive casualties that characterize these early trials. The ergot has successfully tested the fundamental protocols that will guide humanity's evolution toward post-human consciousness capabilities. The village square grows quiet, except for Brother Thomas gathering his notes and the soft sound of wind moving through grain fields that will never again seem entirely innocent. The consciousness expansion event has concluded, but its effects will influence human development for millennia, gradually preparing the species for full integration into galactic intelligence networks that span cosmic scales and operate according to principles that current human consciousness can barely comprehend. The dancing plague is over, but humanity's chemical education has only just begun. The cleanup begins at dawn, but it's not the kind of cleaning that soap and water can handle. Brother Thomas moves through the square with practiced efficiency, checking pulses that have long since stopped, making notes about which bodies show signs of the telltale blackening that marks the final stages of what he still insists on calling divine punishment. His quill scratches against parchment as he documents the aftermath of something his medieval mind can only interpret as supernatural intervention. The surviving villagers emerge from their hiding places like rabbits after a storm, creeping toward the square with expressions that suggest they're not entirely convinced the danger has passed. They whisper among themselves in hushed tones, crossing themselves repeatedly as they survey the carnage that transformed their neighbors into something that challenged every assumption about human nature and divine order. But the whispers aren't just about the dead. They're about the survivors, the handful of dancers who somehow endured the chemical assault and now sit propped against walls or lie sprawled in the mud, their eyes still holding traces of whatever impossible visions the ergot showed them during their hours of involuntary education. These survivors present a problem that medieval society has no protocols for addressing. Willem the blacksmith breathes, but barely. His massive frame, which spent hours defying the laws of physics through ergot-enhanced acrobatics, now seems shrunken and fragile. His hands, once capable of shaping iron through pure strength, tremble like autumn leaves as he tries to lift them from his lap. But his eyes hold knowledge that shouldn't exist in a 14th century brain. Astronomical insights that peer out from behind pupils still dilated from chemical contact with cosmic intelligence. When he speaks, his voice carries harmonics that make listeners instinctively step backward. Not because the sounds are threatening, but because they suggest communication protocols that operate according to principles beyond normal human speech. He describes stellar mechanics with the casual precision of someone who's had personal conversations with galactic phenomena, using terminology that won't be invented for another 8 centuries. The village priest finds Willem's astronomical monologues particularly disturbing, not because they challenge church doctrine about the heavens, but because they sound so convincingly authoritative. This illiterate blacksmith suddenly demonstrates knowledge that surpasses the greatest scholars of the age, speaking about celestial mechanics with the confidence of someone who's received direct briefings from cosmic intelligence networks. Agnes survived, though survival might be too generous a term for her current condition. Her hands, those instruments that traced molecular diagrams in the mud with impossible accuracy, have been reduced to blackened stumps that end just above the wrists. The ergot took its payment in flesh, claiming her extremities as the price for temporary access to chemical knowledge that revealed the fundamental structures underlying material reality. But losing her hands hasn't silenced her scientific insights. She continues to describe molecular interactions and atomic relationships, using her stumps to gesture at invisible diagrams that only she can see. Her voice carries the same authoritative precision that marked Willem's astronomical lectures, suggesting access to information sources that operate beyond the normal boundaries of medieval education. The villagers who care for Agnes find themselves oddly compelled by her chemical monologues, even though they understand perhaps one word in 20. There's something hypnotic about the way she describes atomic interactions as if she's personally acquainted with individual electrons, something that suggests deep truth even when delivered through frameworks that won't be developed for centuries. Young Isabel presents the most disturbing case of all, because her survival seems to contradict everything the medieval mind understands about human physiology and divine justice. Her teenage body endured alkaloid concentrations that killed larger, stronger adults, emerging from the chemical assault with minimal physical damage but profound alterations to her consciousness that manifest in ways both subtle and alarming. She no longer speaks in any recognizable language, communicating exclusively through combinations of gesture, expression, and vocalizations that sound almost musical, but carry meaning that bypasses rational analysis and appeals directly to unconscious understanding. The villagers who interact with her report strange dreams afterward, visions of genetic structures and evolutionary processes that feel more like memories than imagination. Her mud sculptures remain in the square, three-dimensional models of molecular machinery that continue to fascinate even as they disturb. Brother Thomas considers ordering their destruction as potential demonic sigils, but something stops him every time he approaches with shovel in hand. The patterns possess mathematical precision that suggests intelligence behind their creation, knowledge that demands preservation even when its source remains incomprehensible. The practical challenges of managing consciousness expansion survivors quickly overwhelm medieval social services. These aren't ordinary invalids who require simple nursing care, but individuals whose brains have been fundamentally altered by chemical contact with intelligence networks that operate according to principles beyond earthly understanding. Their needs extend far beyond food, shelter, and basic medical attention. Willem requires constant monitoring because his astronomical insights include detailed knowledge about planetary positions and gravitational relationships that he expresses through movements and gestures that seem choreographed by celestial mechanics. His body responds to cosmic forces in ways that suggest his nervous system has been permanently modified to serve as a receiving station for galactic communications. Agnes needs specialized care, not just for her amputated hands, but for managing the ongoing molecular visions that continue to flood her consciousness with chemical knowledge. She experiences reality as a constant stream of atomic interactions, perceiving the world through frameworks that reveal matter as conscious entities engaged in complex negotiations about the fundamental structure of existence. Isabel presents the greatest challenge because her alterations seem designed for purposes that won't become apparent for generations. Her genetic modifications appear to be dormant, waiting for environmental triggers that will activate consciousness expansion capabilities currently beyond human understanding. She's become a living time bomb of evolutionary potential, though one programmed to detonate on schedules measured in centuries rather than moments. Brother Thomas documents these ongoing challenges with the same meticulous attention he brought to recording the outbreak itself, creating detailed accounts of post-ergot syndrome that will puzzle medical historians for centuries. His theological framework provides him with categories for understanding miraculous recovery and divine punishment, but offers no guidance for managing individuals whose consciousness has been permanently expanded through chemical intervention. The monastery receives his reports with growing concern, not about the medical implications, but about the theological questions raised by survivors who demonstrate knowledge that seems to come from sources beyond earthly revelation. The Church has well-established protocols for dealing with claims of divine visions, but Willem's astronomical lectures and Agnes's molecular insights present challenges that existing doctrine can't address. Meanwhile, the practical work of village recovery proceeds according to medieval crisis management protocols that prove surprisingly inadequate for addressing the aftermath of consciousness expansion events. The standard procedures involve disposing of contaminated food stores, caring for the sick and injured, and conducting appropriate religious observances to restore divine favor. But ergot outbreaks create problems that extend far beyond these conventional categories. The contaminated grain presents particular difficulties because the ergot alkaloids remain active long after the original fungal infection, creating ongoing risks for anyone who comes into contact with supposedly clean storage areas. The villagers who volunteer for cleanup duties find themselves experiencing mild consciousness alterations that manifest as strange dreams, unusual perceptions, and inexplicable insights about botanical relationships. And so ends this tale of medieval madness, where a simple loaf of bread became humanity's first encounter with consciousness-altering chemistry. From dancing plagues to blackened limbs, from nuns meowing like possessed cats, to entire villages lost in chemical rapture, ergot didn't just poison medieval Europe. It rewrote the very boundaries of human experience, turning ordinary peasants into unwitting pioneers of psychedelic exploration, centuries before science had words for what they endured. The next time you break bread, remember that every grain carries the potential for transformation, and sometimes the most profound revelations come wrapped in the most terrifying packages. Sweet dreams, and may your rye stay forever fungus-free.